Europe. This relatively small continent stretches from the Atlantic to the Urals and Caucasus, from the Mediterranean to north of Iceland in the Norwegian Sea. Life here is shaped by uniquely favorable conditions.
It's been Mother Nature, the Earth, has been calling the shots.
Nature on this continent has been generous with its inhabitants. It's an excellent habitat for us humans. But sometimes the forces of nature become overpowering.
You can't trust nature. If you engage with the hidden creatures, they'll drag you to your destruction.
The geological character of the continent created a mood of optimism in Europe.
It has been a continent, and ultimately forming a launch pad out into the North Atlantic and across the world.
That had consequences to this day.
For at least 200 years, we Europeans have thought, we are universal, we represent all humanity, and all that is crumbling right now, in a positive sense.
Europe, how geology and nature shape our lives on the continent. Our Earth at 55 degrees north. It spans Canada, Greenland, and Siberia. In winter, the coasts here can get as cold as -20 degrees centigrade. Hardly habitable for humans. The same latitude, but a completely different habitat. Lush green from Great Britain to Norway, mild temperatures, pleasant living conditions. Europe has favorable climatic conditions. Even in the north of the continent, fruit trees and strawberries thrive. And it's been like that for almost 3 million years, thanks to a geological shift on the other side of the globe. A current of warm water still flowed between the Americas into the Pacific. But as the land bridge closed, this current changed direction. The Gulf Stream now transported warm water towards Europe. Sand from the Sahara mixed with it, acting like natural fertilizer and making the Gulf Stream an ideal habitat for fish and marine mammals. The stream warmed the coasts of Europe and pushed warm air and moisture across the continent. This not only ensured mild temperatures, but also regular seasons. Spring and summer are followed by autumn and winter in constant alternation.
It's that geological environment that created the perfect place for bountiful, productive agriculture, burgeoning human populations, and the development of cities and civilization.
Added to that was another favorable circumstance. During the Ice Ages, glaciers pressed down heavily on the underlying rock and split it open. When the ice retreated, loess remained, a fertile mix of quartz and lime. Westerly winds spread this loess across the continent, from the Rhine Delta at the North Sea to the Black Sea. This natural environment shapes our lives. At the Max Planck Institute, researchers are investigating exactly how. They're reconstructing the genes of our ancestors from ancient bones and discovering traces of a turning point in Europe.
In recent years, we have reconstructed thousands of old genomes from the past from Europe. Among them are the original Europeans, the hunter-gatherers whose ancestors migrated to Europe 40,000 years ago, who then lived here in Europe. And then, 7,000 years ago, something exciting and unexpected suddenly happened. The genetics of the inhabitants of Europe changed, and at the same time, their way of life changed too.
Migrants from the southeast reached the continent. Their DNA showed that they'd come a long way.
And in fact, we've seen this DNA signature before in people in the south of Anatolia, which is in the northern part of today's Syria, in the so-called Fertile Crescent.
They migrated from the Fertile Crescent and brought with them a whole new way of life from their homeland. They cultivated fields, farmed and raised livestock. They were sedentary farmers, but they needed more space.
They might have had 5, 6, 7 children because they could have more children than hunter-gatherers, because they could simply produce more food reliably over a given time. And the next generation basically looked for a new field and expanded. And so over several hundred or thousand years, people spread from Western Anatolia through the Balkans to Central Europe and then all over Europe.
The center of gravity, if you like, of European civilization, it moved north from the Mediterranean coastal regions up into the great northern plains of Europe. The huge amounts of arable farmland where the soil is thick and heavy and full of clay, but with the invention of the iron moldboard, the iron plow, is hugely productive for grain and for feeding a growing population in northern Europe.
Our food tradition is rooted in cereals. Durum wheat is typical of the Mediterranean region. Its protein-rich flour is the basis for bread, pizza, and pasta. In Central Europe, rye and barley grow alongside wheat. So in Germany, mixed bread is particularly popular. In the West, wheat inspires the French baguette. In the European North, thin, crisp bread, which can be stored for a particularly long time in the Scandinavian winter. We don't just cultivate fields. Almost all of Europe's natural environment has been shaped by man. But the continent has also forced us to adapt, as a comparison with our ancestors shows.
Of course, these people originally came from a region that is further south, from Anatolia. That means they also had to adapt to the natural conditions here in Europe. And one natural condition that differs between Anatolia and Central Europe, which I'm sure everyone knows if they've ever been on holiday in Turkey, is that there is more sun there. And in winter, it is much brighter than here in Central Europe.
Because of this, the new arrivals had darker skin, but in Europe, this can lead to a vitamin deficiency.
Vitamin D is produced in the skin by sunlight. However, if you don't have much sun, and above all dark skin, then you produce relatively little amounts of vitamin D. This means that the darker the skin, the less vitamin D you can produce. So if you want to live in the north, for example, in Scandinavia, you need light skin.
Humans adapted amazingly quickly. Within a few thousand years, their skin tone became lighter. The Scandinavians have the lightest skin in Europe, a response to the lack of sunlight. The further south one goes, the darker skinned the people are. So the continent dictates how and where people should live on it.
The story through history has been that it's been Mother Nature, the Earth, has been calling the shots in determining where the mountains are, where the seas and coastlines are found, and therefore the different opportunities and resources available to peoples around the world. The Mediterranean Sea, this tiny inland puddle of water, has been a fervent hive of activity for thousands and thousands of years of history. And the reason for that ultimately comes down to plate tectonics.
When the Earth's plates move, they change the face of the continents, and with it, the living conditions there and the historical developments. In the Mediterranean, it is the African plate that collided with the Eurasian continent 120 million years ago. This tectonic showdown created enormous faults that we all know well today.
That's driven up huge chains of mountain ranges across southern Europe, of the Caucasians, the Carpathians, the Alps.
But this doesn't mean that the Earth's interior is at peace. There are still rumblings at the seams of the plates. To this very day. On one of these seams lies Mount Etna in Sicily. Karen Strelo keeps a close eye on the largest and most active of the Mediterranean volcanoes.
Changes are part of a volcano. That's what makes them so exciting, especially for us. The surface of the volcano is constantly moving and changing, and that is precisely what makes Etna one of the most interesting and exciting volcanoes for research in general. In this respect, it's still my Etna. It wouldn't be my Etna if it didn't erupt and change regularly.
Since early 2021, Etna has become restless again. There's been an increase in spontaneous and particularly strong eruptions. They change the entire coastline, and with it, the living conditions for people. Drone measurements show clearly by how much. Mount Etna has grown by 30 meters in just 6 months, commanding a healthy respect among researchers and scientists.
Etna behaves in many different ways. It has not only one crater, but many. It erupts not only at the summit, but also on the flanks. This is especially dangerous when the volcano is close to a coastline, for instance, island volcanoes, because a landslide that goes into the sea can then trigger a tsunami.
In 1908, a quake in the Etna region triggered one of these tsunamis. "72,000 people died. This is why volcanoes are firmly entrenched in our cultural memory as the cause of tremendous catastrophes. At the same time, the restless Earth is a stroke of luck for Europe. It has formed a coastline that uniquely favors the continent.
The coastline of southern Europe is all crumpled and rippled into lots of archipelagos and natural coves and inlets and bays, and it is perfectly set up for seafaring cultures.
The bays of the Mediterranean coast offer well-protected spots for settlements and harbors. Steep slopes keep out wind and weather, with direct access to the sea. The Mediterranean itself has hardly any tides or strong currents. What it does have is a rich source of food: fish. Thousands of islands dot the Mediterranean, shortening distances for travel and trade.
And if you're crossing even from one side of the Mediterranean to the other, trading from the Nile Delta up to Greece, for example, you're never far from sight of land. All of your landmarks for navigation are reliable as you cross this inland sea.
And so the Mediterranean became the ideal transport space for goods and ideas throughout history. The great ancient cultures flourished under these conditions, and their legacy continues to shape our lives today. Ancient Greece was the birthplace of theatre, Olympia, and science, as well as the concept of democracy. The Romans founded our legal system and were pioneers in construction and urban planning. With their road network, they spread technical innovations and unleashed their military power across the continent. They created a unified economic and monetary area that extended almost to the Scottish border in the north and to the Black Sea in the east. This was also how Christianity developed in Europe. Catholicism and later Protestantism established a common European set of values. Following disputes, since 1514 the Church was divided into the Catholic Western Church and the Orthodox Eastern Church.
Antiquity is a foundation stone for the Europe we know today. This is mainly due to the languages. The Latin language became the Romance languages, and that's why we were able to communicate in Europe at all. A huge difference to other continents, where we have completely different language families and huge barriers and hurdles in a very small area.
Attention à la marche en descendant du train. Cuidado con el espacio entre el vagón y el andén. Atenție, se închid ușile.
Ancient heritage permeates every aspect of life today. Gambling, for example. Lottery balls were already used in the Colosseum. The Roman emperors donated the lottery balls as a public relations exercise. At the same time, the lottery ensured that the audience arrived on time. One route of the modern lotto. Or food. Even the ancient Romans enjoyed eating at street food stalls. Precursor of our snack culture. The Greek gods were given sacrificial bread on their birthdays, sometimes even with candles. This gave rise to our custom of baking a cake for a birthday or giving it as a gift. Common European traditions that began in the Mediterranean region. The Romans didn't make it to the far north of the continent. Here, too, geology and nature shape life, but in a very different way. On Iceland, a deep rift, the Silfra Fault, has been pulling the island apart for millions of years. It was triggered by forces deep underground. Wherever there's a break in the Earth's crust, volcanoes form, and with them, islands like Iceland. Lava surges down to the surface of the water, hardens, and adds to Iceland's mass, still to this day. Vegetation has a hard time in this wild landscape of glaciers and volcanoes. On 2/3 of the island, there's almost nothing that grows. The abundance of nature is found in the sea. Fish. This extreme natural environment shapes the lives of Icelanders. For 4 months of the year, the men go to sea to catch fish. The rest of the year, the fishing families live in a cramped space in wind-protected peat houses. The entire extended family comes together in the living room, the so-called badstofa, to work, eat and sleep, but also to tell stories. Stories inspired by a unique natural environment, full of inexplicable phenomena and powerful forces. This is how sagas and fairy tales began, about invisible beings that live in nature and constantly change it. For hundreds of years, they have shaped the cultural memory of Icelanders.
I believe that nature triggers our belief in the supernatural. It's totally logical that this should happen here in Iceland. We have a bizarre landscape where we see images. Added to that is the vigor of nature. When the earth starts to shake, the mountains spit fire or the hot springs emit steam, it's no wonder we think nature has a living soul.
Dozens of rocks in Iceland are believed to be petrified trolls. Icelanders believe that behind the wildness of nature, there are strange beings at work everywhere. They call them Huldufolk, the hidden people. The scary stories of the Huldufolk have long been part of Icelandic children's upbringing.
Many of the Huldufolk tales contain a warning: never trust nature or the weather. If you get involved with the hidden beings, they will drag you into misfortune or death. Many stories are about the danger of something supernatural that you do not understand.
To this day, these beliefs are deeply rooted in society. Especially in this district of the capital, Reykjavik, there are numerous rocks that are considered to have a soul and are therefore sacred. They may neither be removed nor built over. This is because, since 2012, these rocks have been protected by the Elven Heritage Act. The result is rocky wastelands and unusual pathways, narrowed roads and windows without a view. Entire construction plans are rewritten specifically to preserve the rocks. For the building authorities, the belief in elves is a particular challenge. It's especially awkward for road construction.
10 years ago, we started planning a road until we heard from the locals about a very beautiful stone. The stone was called Ófeigskirkja, which means elf church. So we had to get in touch with the elves and negotiate through a lady with experience in this field.
The authorities hired a seer to consult the beings in the stone, as the TV reported.
When it became clear that the road was to be built, The elves and the hidden people explicitly asked for this area to be protected. We are standing here in a sanctuary we call an elf church.
The authorities followed the seer's advice. They moved the 70-ton stone to a different location that the elves were allowed to choose themselves. There are stories about elves from many places in Iceland. The mythical creatures are a big topic in people's everyday lives too, because they supposedly love to mock and make fools of people.
Of course, elves influence my life. When I lose something, the elves are often behind it. It's about respect for nature and for the elves. I once lived in a house with an elf church in the garden. I even wrote letters to them. These little things influence our daily life.
When I'm in nature, I feel that I am not alone here and that everything is somehow connected. For me, that is what the elves are all about.
According to surveys, 8% of Icelanders believe in elves. 57% of them at least don't want to rule out the possibility that they exist. The island's rugged nature and Icelanders' love of stories seem to go hand in hand. More than half the people living on the island read at least 8 books a year. Only in Sweden and Finland do they read more. Surrounded by the wildness of nature, Icelanders tend to be willing to take risks, true to their motto in life: everything will work out fine. Living in close communities generates trust in their fellow human beings. This is probably one of the reasons why Iceland has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. In Scandinavia, too, nature is not always an ally. Beyond the fjords lie tundra and forests on poor soils. Good settlement areas are rare. The reason is that the Ice Age glaciers scraped free the stony core of the continental plate as they retreated. This left behind only small pockets of fertile soil. Compared to other European countries, Scandinavia has a harder time with agriculture than other parts of the continent. Tough conditions for the people who want to settle here. The Vikings rose to the challenge. Early on, men and women shared the work. While most of the men were out raiding or fishing, the women organized life on the farm. The assertive clans refused to bow to any aristocratic rulers.
There is definitely a connection. Living in small, hard-working communities helped keep hierarchies flat. That's why we didn't have feudal nobility. And that led to our way of life today. We even address our politicians by their first names.
The concept of equality is still characteristic of Scandinavian countries, above all Norway, one of the most sparsely populated countries in Europe. Norway has one of the longest road networks in the world in relation to its population. And to connect the various parts of the country, they have to bridge fjords of up to 3 kilometers wide. The aim is to ensure that every family is able to participate in public life and own their own house. Those who cannot afford it from their own resources are supported by the state. And Norway also invests heavily in education and culture for all. The country spends almost 6% of its gross domestic product on education alone. Scandinavia as a whole is considered a pioneer for participation and equality.
Throughout history, we have always had a division of labor between the sexes. On the farms, everyone had to do his or her part to make a living in agriculture. As a result, we place a lot of emphasis on strong family cohesion and equality.
In Norway, there are almost as many female as male members of parliament. In families, men are increasingly taking on childcare. In a global comparison of countries with the highest gender equality, 4 Scandinavian nations are currently in the top 5. The progress of modern Scandinavian societies is also rooted in the North's challenging natural environment. In the center of Europe, the Earth's history influences our development in a different way. Hills and mountains divide the continent into regions, like a puzzle with hundreds of pieces. On the other hand, 37,000 kilometers of waterways connect the continent of Europe, making it more accessible than any other.
Europe is also unique because its geography divides on the one hand and brings us together on the other. We have large rivers that define cultural areas, but we also have barriers. This is where communication stalls, and behind these natural barriers, a different culture actually begins.
So geography is responsible for plenty of rivalry too. In the Middle Ages, a patchwork of hundreds of different dominions emerged in Europe. My castle, my lord, my currency. On the one hand, this constantly generated conflicts. On the other, Europe became a competitive continent. Business and technology, but also science, advanced as a result. With the rivalries, clichés flourished too. In the Styrian ethnic table from the 18th century, the Styrians classified their direct neighbors: the open-hearted German, the war-obsessed French, and the peasant Polish.
For a long time, we believed that these regions would be absorbed into nations. But today we know that nations consist of regions, and that people need a regional identity, but not necessarily a national identity.
To this day, Europe's regions still strive for independence, sometimes against the state to which they belong. There is no other continent with so many independence movements. They're active in 30 regions, from Sardinia to the Faroe Islands, Northern Ireland to Transylvania. The 2.7 million Basques also see themselves as belonging to an independent region. This strong sense of identity stems from the power of geography. Because both mountains and sea define the Basque Country as a region in its own right. Politically, it belongs to Spain and France. Its remoteness has helped an ancient language to survive that is unrelated to any of the European language families. Basque is completely independent. It is the expression of Basque identity.
We're Basque. We speak Basque because we grew up with the language from an early age, and that is why, deep down, we identify as Basque.
This has given the Basques a hard time in the Spanish state. Under Franco's dictatorship, all efforts towards autonomy were banned until 1975, and with them, the Basque language and regional traditions.
We carried on speaking Basque at home, but when I went to school, it was completely forbidden. It was only 40 or even more years later that I discovered that some of my classmates also spoke Basque. We all knew it, but we didn't use the language for fear of repression. That was our life.
The Basques invented a loophole. They met in so-called cooking cooperatives, culinary clubs that cooked for their own members in restaurants.
We could speak Basque there too, but only cautiously, because you didn't know who might be listening. The cooking cooperatives were not isolated spots with no repression, but we were lucky. We were never searched or anything like that. Others were.
The cooking cooperatives bolstered the solidarity of the Basques against the dominating Spaniards and, incidentally, also their regional cuisine. Today, the Basque Country has the highest number of star-rated restaurants in Europe per head of population.
As the name Euskaldunak suggests, Basques are people who speak Basque. That is the simplest definition. Officially, I am Spanish, but the heart is the heart. And deep in our hearts, we are Basques, and we want to live as Basques.
Europe, the continent of regions shaped by nature. But so was the Europeans' urge to go out into the world. Our coasts shaped the history and culture of Europe like no other natural environment.
Europe as being a continent dominated by the sea, a continent which has benefited from the opportunities offered by the sea for trade and communication and the sharing of ideas.
Western Europe has an extremely long coastline in relation to its landmass, much longer than that of the USA or Russia, for example, the best conditions for setting off for unknown shores.
You could describe Europe as being the land of peninsulas, not just the intricate coastline of the northern Mediterranean, but the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal jutting out into the North Atlantic, and then ultimately forming a launch pad out into the North Atlantic and across the world with the age of exploration and the age of sail.
A race for glory and resources began on the densely populated continent. The Portuguese landed on the west coast of Africa. Christopher Columbus, on the other hand, in America, which he mistook for India. There began a global era of trade, but also one of exploitation.
Europe in the 1500s was a greedy continent. Europeans wanted gold, they wanted silver, and they wanted spices. And what sounds like a success story for some was a disaster for others. The American continent was densely populated at this time, and within 100 years, large parts of these American cultures were destroyed, and 90% of the population there was killed, mostly murdered. Some died of diseases. A success story that was a great failure for others. And as always in history, there was much light and even more shadow.
Europe viewed itself as the mother of the continents. This is also reflected in maps, in which the small continent is depicted as oversized. By 1914, Europe's nations controlled 40% of the world's landmass. In Europe itself, an appetite for questionable exoticism began. People were put on show like animals in zoos. The format was called ethnological exposition and persisted until the 1930s. Hundreds of thousands of cultural objects from Africa, Oceania, the Americas, and Asia were brought to Europe. But their return changed Europe's self-image.
For at least 200 years, we Europeans have thought, we are universal, we represent all humanity, and all that is crumbling right now, in a positive sense.
For over 100 years, more and more food from far-off lands has enhanced our everyday lives. At first, they were reserved exclusively for the rich. Exotic fruits, coffee or tea were barely affordable luxuries. But in Germany, the Purchasing Cooperative for Colonial Goods Dealers, or EDK for short, wanted to make these goods affordable for everyone. Attitudes towards food began slowly to change. Food from around the world, available at any time, at reasonable prices, an aspiration that for many is now a matter of course. Germans alone import more than 100,000 tons of coffee beans every month. This averages out at 162 liters of coffee that we drink per capita per year. Our daily menu would be unimaginable without food from the former colonies. What lands up here from foreign countries has enriched all our cuisines. Potatoes came from Peru. They thrived excellently in Europe and became national dishes such as Belgian frites or English fish and chips. Hungarian goulash and Spanish chorizo owe their popularity to peppers from America. German runner beans originated there too. But Europe itself had a raw material, an energy source that would radically change life on the continent and subsequently worldwide. Over millions of years, processes in the Earth's interior created deposits that stretched in a huge crescent from Eastern Europe across Germany and France to England. But for a long time, the raw material stored here remained unused. Until the 13th century, when large parts of Europe had been widely deforested. This was when people in northern England began to burn the easily accessible and highly combustible coal on a grand scale. The black gold became the fuel of a new era. Coal powered a new invention, the steam engine. This paved the way for operating large machines in even larger factories. Coal drove the industrial age in Europe. Coal satisfied the new era's enormous hunger for energy. With its help, iron and steel were produced on an industrial scale. And this industrial revolution set in motion an unprecedented acceleration in life. Europe, gifted by nature, was once again the driver of civilization.
Industrialization changed the way that we live our lives. Combined with new sources of light, like gas lights and then electricity, humans stayed up much later into the night rather than going to sleep with the sunset.
In the big factories, new values began to emerge with the new form of work, cohesion and solidarity against the pressure of circumstances.
If you have a big, expensive factory churning out products, you want to maximize the profit you can get for your investment. You have long working days, broken down on particular shifts, and so time became really important with the Industrial Revolution, and clocks and the minute.
But clocks still ticked differently everywhere. At the end of the 19th century, the German Empire was a patchwork quilt with different times. It wasn't until 1893 that the law for the introduction of a uniform determination of time was passed in Germany. This ended the confusion of Munich, Berlin, or other regional time zones. Instead, Central European time applied throughout Germany.
So the way that we live our lives today, with alarm clocks to wake us up when we're still tired and living under electric lights deep into the night, all of that descends back through history to the discovery of these rocks underground that burn.
The age of coal is almost over in Europe, but according to studies, solidarity is still an important value in the old industrial regions. Team spirit counts most of all where people dream of social advancement. This is also apparent in everyday life. In German kiosks, you can do more than just shop. Packages are accepted here, keys are kept, worries shared.
Buddha, kiosk, Bütchen, it's got many names, and that's part of what it is, the kiosk.
Originally, there were facilities set up by the steel mills and collieries as a cheap supply source for the workers' families. The factories are gone, but the values live on.
You stick together, know, and help each other too.
Can you carry a shopping bag upstairs for me? A lot of old people live here. Sticking together is definitely not social romanticism here. It's real. It happens every day.
Rarely has a condition of nature shaped people's lives as much as coal. Industrialization has not just changed Europe profoundly, but also the relationship between humans and nature.
We now have so much capability with our technology and our industry that it is us that is changing the world rather than vice versa. We are changing the composition of the atmosphere, or we are warming the climate of the entire planet. We are moving more sediment with our mining than all the rivers on the planet put together.
Man-made climate change poses completely new challenges for Europe. Once again, the continent's natural conditions could determine how people live in the future.
Europe is a strong continent because it has strong geography. And in times of climate change and more difficult cultivation conditions worldwide, it will become evident and is already evident that we have fewer natural disasters and extreme weather events in Europe than in many parts of Asia, Africa, and North and South America. And in this respect, indicators suggest that the great age of Europe is yet to come. But not to make the world happy, rather, Europe has the chance to become something like the Noah's Ark of the 21st century through its geography.
Europe, a continent that geology and nature have endowed with favorable conditions for life. In the future, this will be more important than ever.